Evan had been dealing with an annoying itch for weeks. At first, he brushed it off as dry skin or maybe an allergic reaction to the new detergent his wife, Clara, had bought. But the itching didn't go away. In fact, it only seemed to get worse. It started on his arms and legs, but soon Evan felt it everywhere. His back, his neck, even his scalp. He couldn't escape the sensation that something was crawling under his skin. Clara noticed how often Evan scratched himself during dinner. One evening, "You've got to stop doing that," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "You're going to make your skin raw." "I can't help it," Evan replied, rubbing at a particularly troublesome spot on his forearm. "It feels like, I don't know, like bugs are crawling all over me." Clara frowned. "Bugs? You think you have fleas or something?" "I don't know what else it could be," Evan muttered, shaking his head. "I haven't been around any animals lately, but this feels real, like they're under my skin." Clara tried not to laugh. It sounded ridiculous. But when she saw the look of genuine distress on Evan's face, her amusement faded. She reached across the table and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Maybe we should take you to the doctor," she suggested gently, "just to be safe." Evan hesitated. He wasn't the type to run to the doctor for every little thing. But the constant itching was driving him crazy. "Fine," he finally agreed. "But if the doctor tells me it's just stress or something, I'm blaming you." The next day, after work, Evan reluctantly went to see Dr. Patel, their family physician. The doctor listened patiently as Evan described the relentless itching and the strange sensation of movement beneath his skin. After a thorough examination, Dr. Patel prescribed a mild antihistamine and advised Evan to avoid scratching so much. "Sometimes these things can be psychosomatic," the doctor explained. "Stress manifests in different ways and itching is one of them." Evan left the office feeling frustrated. He didn't feel stressed, at least no more than usual, and he was certain there was something physically wrong with him. Still, he followed the doctor's advice and took the medication faithfully. For a few days, the itching subsided, and Evan began to believe that maybe it had all been in his head. But then, late one night, as he lay in bed next to Clara, the itching returned with a vengeance. This time, it wasn't just a general irritation, it was concentrated in specific spots. His lower back, the crook of his elbow behind his knee. Evan sat up abruptly, scratching furiously. "It's back," he whispered hoarsely, trying not to wake Clara. She stirred beside him, blinking sleepily. "What's back?" she mumbled. "The itching," Evan hissed, "and it's worse than ever." Clara sighed, sitting up and turning on the bedside lamp. "Let me see," she said, squinting at his arm. As Evan held still, she leaned closer, examining his skin, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't see anything. Wait." She tilted her head, peering intently at a small red bump near his wrist. "Is that moving?" Evan froze. "What do you mean, moving?" Clara didn't answer right away. Instead, she grabbed her phone from the nightstand and switched on the flashlight feature, shining it directly onto Evan's arm. What she saw made her gasp sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? What is it?" Evan demanded, panic rising in his chest. Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Evan, there's something under your skin." For a moment, neither of them moved. The room was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Then, without warning, Clara let out a blood-curdling scream, dropping the phone and stumbling backward. Evan's heart raced as he stared at her in shock. "What did you see?" he shouted, grabbing her shoulders. "Tell me." But Clara couldn't speak. She pointed shakily at his arm, her wide eyes filled with terror. And for the first time, Evan truly understood that whatever was happening to him was far more serious and far stranger than he could have ever imagined. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at Clara, her face pale and trembling. "What did you see?" he demanded again, his voice rising with panic. "Tell me, Clara." Clara shook her head, unable to form words. She pointed weakly at his arm, her hand shaking so badly that Evan could barely follow where she was indicating. He grabbed the phone from the floor, its flashlight still on, and shone it over his own skin. At first, all he saw were tiny red bumps, irritations he'd assumed were caused by scratching too hard. But then something caught his eye. One of the bumps moved. It wasn't a twitch or a trick of the light. It actually shifted beneath his skin like something alive was wriggling just below the surface. Evan froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment he thought he might pass out. His stomach churned and nausea rolled through him as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "Clara," he whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "What is this? What's happening to me?" Clara finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and strained. "I don't know," she admitted, tears welling up in her eyes. "But we need help. We can't figure this out alone." The couple sat in stunned silence for several minutes, neither of them knowing what to do next. Finally, Evan forced himself to take a deep breath. "Okay," he said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. "We'll go back to Dr. Patel tomorrow morning. First thing." Clara nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Do you think it could be some kind of parasite?" she asked hesitantly. "I don't know," Evan replied, running a hand through his hair. "But whatever it is, it's not normal." They decided to try and get some sleep, though neither of them expected rest to come easily. Evan lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling while the sensation of crawling under his skin persisted. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined tiny creatures burrowing deeper into his body, spreading their way through his veins and muscles. It was maddening and terrifying. When morning finally arrived, they wasted no time getting dressed and heading to Dr. Patel's office. The waiting room was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of magazines being flipped through. Evan tapped his foot nervously, unable to sit still. Clara reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his knee, though her own anxiety was evident in the tightness of her grip. When they were called into the examination room, Dr. Patel greeted them with a warm smile that quickly faded when she saw the look on their faces. "You're back sooner than I expected," she said, glancing between Evan and Clara. "Is everything okay?" "No," Clara blurted out before Evan could speak. "There's something wrong with him, something serious." Dr. Patel's brow furrowed as she turned her attention to Evan. "What happened?" Evan swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "Last night, my wife noticed something moving under my skin." He hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding insane. "At first, I thought maybe it was just my imagination, but then I saw it too. There's something there, doctor. Something alive." Dr. Patel's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. She gestured for Evan to roll up his sleeve, and he complied, holding out his arm. Using a magnifying glass and a bright lamp, she examined the area closely. After a few tense moments, she let out a slow breath. "Well," she began, cautiously, "this isn't something I've encountered before. These marks, they almost resemble tracks left by certain types of parasites. Have you traveled recently? Been exposed to unsanitary conditions?" Evan shook his head. "No, nothing like that. I haven't left the city in months." Dr. Patel frowned, clearly puzzled. "I'd like to run some tests," she said after a pause. "Blood work, imaging scans, anything that might help us identify what's causing this." Relief washed over Evan, though it was short-lived. Tests meant answers, but they also meant waiting, and waiting felt impossible when every second brought new waves of itching and dread. Still, he nodded eagerly. "Whatever you need," he said. "Just tell us what to do." As Clara filled out paperwork and scheduled the necessary appointments, Evan sat quietly, staring at his hands. Deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a medical issue. Something about it felt unnatural, like the universe itself had conspired against him, planting a secret horror within his very flesh. By the time they left the clinic, the day had grown darker, clouds gathering overhead as if mirroring Evan's growing unease. As they drove home, Clara broke the silence. "Do you think it's serious?" she asked softly. I don't know, Evan admitted, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But one thing's for sure. We're not going to find out sitting around waiting. Little did they know, the answers they sought would lead them down a path far stranger and far more dangerous than either of them could have anticipated. The days leading up to Evan's tests were agonizing. Every moment felt like an eternity, and the itching continued to worsen. It wasn't just his arms anymore. The crawling sensation had spread across his chest, down his legs, even along his scalp. Evan couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep at night, and barely ate during meals. His once healthy complexion was now pale and drawn, dark circles forming under his eyes from lack of rest. Clara did her best to stay strong for him, but she too was struggling. She spent hours online researching strange skin conditions, parasites, and rare diseases, hoping to find something that matched Evan's symptoms. But the more she read, the more frightened she became. Some of the articles mentioned exotic infections found only in remote parts of the world, places neither of them had ever been. Others described bizarre medical anomalies with no clear explanation or cure. None of it made sense, and none of it brought them any closer to understanding what was happening to Evan. On the morning of the scheduled tests, Clara drove Evan to the hospital, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Neither of them spoke much on the way there. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy between them. When they arrived, a nurse led Evan into a small room where he underwent a series of procedures. Blood was drawn, X-rays were taken, and a dermatologist carefully examined his skin using specialized equipment. The process took hours, leaving Clara pacing anxiously in the waiting area while Evan endured one test after another. Finally, the doctor overseeing the tests, a stern-looking man named Dr. Harris, entered the room where Evan sat, still shirtless and covered in cold gel from the ultrasound. "We've gathered all the samples we need," Dr. Harris said, his tone professional, but unreadable. "It will take some time to analyze everything, but I'll make sure the results are prioritized." "How long?" Evan asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "A few days at least," Dr. Harris replied. "I wish I could give you answers sooner, but these things take time." Evan nodded reluctantly, though disappointment weighed heavily on him. He knew rushing wouldn't change anything, but the thought of waiting, even for a few days, felt unbearable. When they returned home, Evan collapsed onto the couch, exhausted both physically and emotionally. Clara joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll get through it together." Evan managed a weak smile, grateful for her support, but deep down he wasn't so sure. The crawling sensation beneath his skin seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, as if whatever was inside him was multiplying. He tried to distract himself by watching TV, but his mind kept drifting back to the horrifying image of movement under his flesh. What if the doctors couldn't identify it? What if they couldn't stop it? That night, unable to sleep, Evan wandered into the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. Turning on the light, he rolled up his sleeves and examined his arms closely. The red bumps were more pronounced now, some of them darker than before. As he watched, one of them shifted slightly, a tiny ripple beneath the surface of his skin. Evan's stomach churned and he quickly turned away, unable to look any longer. Suddenly he heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. At first he thought it might be Clara checking on him, but when he stepped out of the bathroom, the house was eerily quiet. The sound came again, a soft scratching, almost imperceptible, like something brushing against wood. Evan froze, straining to listen. "Clara?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Are you awake?" There was no response. The scratching continued, growing louder and closer. Heart racing, Evan followed the sound, moving cautiously toward the living room. When he reached the doorway, he stopped dead in his tracks. On the coffee table lay a pile of sand-like particles, shimmering faintly in the dim light. They hadn't been there earlier. He was certain of it. Evan approached slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he leaned closer to inspect the mysterious substance, he noticed something else. Tiny footprints trailing across the floor, leading toward the front door. They were impossibly small, almost insect-like, yet distinct, enough to send chills down his spine. Before he could react, the front door creaked open on its own, letting in a gust of cold air. Outside, the streetlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows across their yard. Evan hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Whatever was happening to him, it was clear that it wasn't confined to his body anymore. It had begun to invade their home. "Clara!" he shouted, turning back toward the bedroom. "Wake up! Something's wrong." Clara appeared moments later, her face pale with confusion. "What is it?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Evan pointed toward the door, his hand shaking. "Look, outside." She followed his gaze, her eyes widening in shock as she saw the footprints and the open door. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, the lights in the house flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the silence that followed, a single thought echoed in Evan's mind. This isn't over. The sudden loss of power plunged the house into an unsettling darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows. Evan's breath caught in his throat as he fumbled for his phone, quickly turning on the flashlight feature. The beam illuminated Clara's frightened face and the eerie trail of tiny footprints leading toward the open door. "What's going on?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't normal, Evan. None of this is normal." Evan didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what they were witnessing. The itching, the movement under his skin, the strange sand-like particles, and now this. It was as if something unnatural had taken root in their lives, spreading its influence beyond Evan's body and into their home. "We need to close the door," Evan said finally, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. He stepped forward, cautiously, keeping the flashlight trained on the floor. As he approached the threshold, he noticed that the footprints stopped abruptly just outside the doorway. Beyond them, the yard was eerily still, the wind having died down completely. Clara stayed close behind him, her hand gripping his arm tightly. Together they peered into the night, searching for any sign of movement or explanation. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. "Let's lock it," Clara urged, pulling Evan back inside. Once the door was securely closed, she turned the deadbolt and flipped the chain. Lock for good measure. "We should call someone," she added, her voice rising with urgency. "The police, maybe, or an exterminator?" Evan shook his head. "What are we going to tell them? That there are things in our house? They'll think we're crazy." Clara opened her mouth to argue but hesitated, realizing he was right. How could they explain what they'd seen without sounding like they'd lost their minds? Instead, she suggested, "Maybe we should check the rest of the house. Make sure nothing else is out of place." Reluctantly, Evan agreed. Armed with his phone's flashlight, they began a slow and methodical search of every room. The living room appeared untouched, save for the mysterious pile of sand-like particles on the coffee table. The kitchen was clean, the cabinets undisturbed. Even the bathroom showed no signs of intrusion. But as they climbed the stairs to the second floor, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the atmosphere itself had shifted. When they reached the bedroom, Evan froze in the doorway. The bedclothes were rumpled as if someone or something had been lying there moments ago. On the nightstand beside the bed sat another small pile of the shimmering sand, identical to the one downstairs. Clara gasped, clutching Evan's arm, even tighter. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "What does it want from us?" Evan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that whatever was happening, it seemed to revolve around him. The itching, the crawling sensation, the footprints, they all pointed to some connection between him and these inexplicable events. He felt a surge of guilt, knowing that Clara was being dragged into this nightmare because of him. As they stood, there paralyzed by fear, a soft sound broke the silence, a faint whisper so quiet it was almost imperceptible. Both of them stiffened, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Evan nodded slowly, straining to listen. At first, the whispers sounded random, like fragments of words spoken in a language neither of them recognized. But as they continued, the voices grew clearer, more distinct. They weren't coming from outside the house. They were coming from inside the walls. Clara backed away instinctively, her hands covering her ears. "Make it. Stop," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Evan wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't tear his attention away from the wall. The whispers were growing louder now, overlapping each other in a chaotic symphony. And then, amidst the cacophony, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Your fault?" The voices hissed in unison. "All your fault." Evan staggered, backward, nearly dropping the phone. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." But the voices persisted, relentless and accusing. Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the hallway. "We need to leave," she insisted, her voice frantic. "Now!" Without waiting for a response, she dragged him downstairs and out the front door. The cool night air hit them like a wave, offering a brief reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere inside. They didn't stop until they reached the car, slamming the doors shut behind them. For a moment they sat in silence, breathing heavily as adrenaline coursed through their veins. Then Clara turned to Evan, her expression desperate. "What did those voices mean?" she demanded. "What do they know about you?" Evan stared at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. Deep down, he suspected he already knew the truth, but admitting it would mean confronting a part of himself he'd buried long ago. The car sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the engine as Evan and Clara tried to catch their breath. The night was cold, but neither of them noticed. It was the weight of what they had just experienced that left them frozen. Clara's eyes were fixed on Evan, searching for answers he seemed reluctant to give. "What did those voices mean?" she asked again, her voice softer this time but no less insistent. "What do they know about you?" Evan stared out the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't want to answer, didn't want to admit the truth, but the accusing whispers still echoed in his mind. Finally, after a long pause, he sighed deeply and turned to face her. "There's something I never told you," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "Something from my past." Clara's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with fear. "What are you talking about?" Evan hesitated, struggling to find the words. "Years ago, before we met, I did something terrible. Something I've spent my whole life trying to forget." Clara waited, her heart pounding. She could see the pain etched on his face, the guilt weighing him down like an invisible anchor. Whatever it was, it clearly haunted him. "I was involved in an accident," Evan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "A car crash. It wasn't just me. It was late at night, and there were people in the other vehicle. A family." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "They didn't make it." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, shock rippling through her. "Oh my God, Evan." "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "It was raining and I lost control of the car. By the time the police arrived, I was in shock. I couldn't even remember how it happened. But when they told me, when they showed me the pictures," he trailed off, tears welling up in his eyes. "I've carried that guilt ever since. I moved away, changed my life, tried to start over. I thought if I buried it deep enough, maybe I could pretend it never happened." Clara reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked gently. "Because I was ashamed," Evan admitted. "I didn't want you to look at me differently. I didn't want anyone to know." They sat in silence for a moment, the enormity of Evan's confession hanging between them. Then, Clara spoke, her tone resolute. "Evan, none of this is your fault. That accident, it was tragic, yes, but it doesn't define who you are. You're not responsible for what's happening now." Evan shook his head, his expression grim. "But what if I am? What if somehow this is connected?" Before Clara could respond, a loud thud against the hood of the car startled them both. They turned toward the sound, their flashlights illuminating the space outside. At first there was nothing, But then slowly, tiny cracks began to form on the windshield, spreading outward like spiderwebs. Inside the cracks, shimmering particles of sand-like material appeared, glowing faintly in the dim light. Clara screamed, instinctively recoiling into her seat. Evan fumbled with the keys, starting the engine and throwing the car into reverse. Tires screeching, they sped away from the house, leaving behind the eerie glow and the oppressive feeling that had taken over their home. As they drove aimlessly through the empty streets, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly safe. The crawling sensation beneath his skin had returned, stronger than ever, as if whatever was inside him was growing restless. And the whispers, they lingered at the edge of his consciousness, faint but persistent, repeating the same phrase over and over. Your fault, your fault, your fault. We can't keep running, Clara said finally, breaking the tense silence. We need answers. If this really is connected to your past, maybe someone else knows something, someone who can help us. Evan nodded reluctantly, though the idea filled him with dread. The last thing he wanted was to dig up old wounds, but Clara was right. They couldn't keep living like this. If there was a way to stop whatever was happening, they had to find it. When they arrived at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town, they parked and went inside, hoping to regroup and come up with a plan. Over cups of strong coffee, Clara pulled out her phone and began searching for information about the accident. The names of the victims, any surviving family members, anything that might lead them to someone who could shed light on what was happening. After several minutes of scrolling, she found something, a name that sent chills down her spine. Evan, she said quietly, turning the screen toward him. Do you recognize this woman? Evan's blood ran cold as he stared at the photo. It was grainy and faded, but there was no mistaking the face. It belonged to a young girl who had been in the other car that night, the sole survivor of the crash. She's alive, Clara whispered, and she lives nearby. Evan felt a surge of emotions, guilt, fear, and a flicker of hope. Maybe she held the key to understanding what was happening to him. Or maybe confronting her would only make things worse. Either way, they both knew, one thing for certain, they couldn't turn back now. The next morning, Evan and Clara sat in their car outside a small, weathered apartment building. The address matched the one Clara had found online, the home of Sarah Bennett, the sole survivor of the accident that had haunted Evan for years. Neither of them spoke as they stared at the building, their nerves taut like stretched wires. Are you ready for this? Clara asked finally, glancing at Evan. Her voice was gentle but firm, trying to offer support without pushing him too hard. Evan shook his head, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. No, he admitted. But I don't think we have a choice. Clara nodded, understanding the weight of what they were about to do. Let's just take it slow. See how she reacts. With a deep breath, Evan stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, Clara close behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was resisting their approach. When they reached the door marked with Sarah's number, Evan hesitated, raising his hand to knock but pausing mid-motion. What if she hates me? He whispered, turning to Clara. What if seeing me makes everything worse? She might, Clara replied honestly. But we won't know unless we try, and right now she's our only lead. Evan swallowed hard and knocked on the door. A few moments passed before soft footsteps could be heard from inside. Then, the door opened slightly, revealing a young woman with tired eyes and shoulder-length, brown hair. She wore a cautious expression, her gaze flickering between Evan and Clara. Can I help you? She asked, her voice guarded. Evan cleared his throat, struggling to find the words. Hi, my name is Evan. I was involved in an accident many years ago. With your family. Sarah's eyes widened, and she instinctively took a step back. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the sound of distant traffic. Then her expression hardened. I remember, she said flatly, her tone laced with bitterness. Why are you here? Evan winced at her coldness but forced himself to continue. I'm sorry, for everything. I've spent years trying to forget what happened, but something strange has been going on lately. Something connected to me, to my skin. He gestured vaguely at his arms, though the crawling sensation beneath them had momentarily subsided. I thought maybe you could help me understand. Sarah studied him carefully, her jaw tightening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said reluctantly. Inside, the apartment was modest but tidy, with faded furniture and shelves lined with books and photographs. One photo in particular caught Evan's eye, a picture of Sarah as a child, standing beside her parents and younger brother. The sight made his chest tighten with guilt. "Sit," Sarah said, motioning to the couch. She remained standing, arms crossed, watching them closely. Evan took a seat, Clara beside him. "Thank you for letting us in," he began. "I know this must be difficult for you." "It is," Sarah replied sharply. "You show up out of nowhere after all these years expecting answers? Do you even realize how much you destroyed?" Her words hit Evan like a punch to the gut, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he nodded slowly. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "And more. But please, if there's anything you know, anything that might explain why this is happening, it could save both of us." Sarah frowned, clearly skeptical. "Explain. What exactly?" Clara leaned forward, speaking for the first time. "Evan has been experiencing things. Movement under his skin, strange noises, even footprints appearing in his house. It started shortly after he realized something was wrong with his body. We think it might be connected to the accident somehow." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, curiosity replacing some of her anger. "That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. "Unless—" She trailed off, her eyes narrowing as if recalling something long forgotten. "Unless what?" Evan pressed, leaning closer. Sarah hesitated, then moved to a bookshelf and pulled out a leather-bound journal. "After the accident, I started having nightmares," she explained, flipping through the pages. "Dreams about shadows moving under my skin, voices whispering accusations. Doctor said it was trauma, but I wasn't so sure. So I wrote everything down." She handed the journal to Evan, who opened it carefully. The pages were filled with detailed entries describing symptoms eerily similar to his own. There were sketches of red bumps, descriptions of crawling sensations, and notes about glowing sand-like particles appearing in her room. "This can't be a coincidence," Clara said, her voice trembling. "It's like whatever affected you, it's affecting him too." Sarah nodded grimly. "I've spent years researching this. At first I thought it was just in my head, but the patterns kept repeating. I traced it back to something ancient, something tied to unresolved grief." Evan looked up, confusion etched on his face. "Ancient? What does that mean?" Sarah sighed, sitting down across from them. "There are stories, legends, about spirits that feed on guilt and pain. They attach themselves to people who carry deep regrets, using their suffering to grow stronger. If you buried your guilt, instead of confronting it, they found a way in," Evan finished, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded. "And now they're spreading. You need to face what you've been running from, or this will never end." Evan felt a chill run down his spine. Facing his guilt meant reliving the worst night of his life. But if it was the only way to stop the torment, he knew he had no choice. As they left Sarah's apartment, Evan turned to Clara, determination in his eyes. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly, "even if it means going back to where it all began." The drive to the site of the accident was long and silent, each mile stretching Evan's nerves tighter. The road was familiar yet foreign, a place he had avoided for years. As they approached the desolate stretch of highway where it had all happened, Clara reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. "I'm here with you." Evan nodded, grateful for her presence but unable to shake the weight of what lay ahead. The crawling sensation beneath his skin had grown unbearable, as if the unseen force within him knew they were nearing its origin. Tiny red bumps covered his arms and neck now, glowing faintly in the dim light of the setting sun. When they arrived, the area looked much the same as it had that fateful night. Empty fields on either side of the road, trees lining the horizon. Like silent witnesses, Evan parked the car and stepped out, his legs trembling slightly. Clara followed, holding a flashlight in one hand and gripping Evan's arm with the other. "Where should we start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Evan closed his eyes, trying to recall the exact spot where the crash had occurred. He could still picture it vividly. The screech of tires, the blinding headlights, the sickening impact. When he opened his eyes, he pointed to a patch of grass just off the shoulder of the road. "There," he said hoarsely. "That's where it happened." They walked toward the spot, their footsteps crunching against the dry earth. As they drew closer, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the very atmosphere was resisting their presence. Clara shone the flashlight around, revealing strange patterns in the dirt, small trails that resembled the footprints they'd seen in their home. Evan knelt down, running his fingers through the soil. It felt unnaturally warm, almost alive beneath his touch. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They surrounded him, filling his mind with accusations and guilt. "You ran. You hid. You didn't deserve forgiveness." Tears streamed down Evan's face as he clutched his head, overwhelmed by the voices. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around him. "Fight it," she urged. "Remember what Sarah said. You have to confront it." Summoning every ounce of courage, Evan forced himself to stand. He turned slowly in a circle, addressing the empty air. "I'm sorry," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry for what I did. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." For a moment, nothing changed. The whispers continued, relentless and cruel. Then slowly the ground beneath them began to tremble. A faint glow emerged from the soil, pulsating like a heartbeat. Sand-like particles rose into the air, swirling around Evan in a shimmering vortex. Clara stepped back, shielding her face from the wind that had suddenly picked up. "Evan, keep going," she called out. "Tell them everything." Evan took a deep breath, his voice steadying. "I've spent my life running from this," he admitted, tears streaming down his cheeks. "But I can't anymore. I won't. If there's anything left of your family, please forgive me. Please let me make this right." As the words left his mouth, the vortex of sand intensified, forming shapes that flickered like ghostly figures. Evan froze, recognizing the faces. They were the people who had died that night. Their expressions were unreadable at first, but gradually they softened, their eyes filled with sorrow rather than anger. One figure stepped forward, a woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah. She reached out, her translucent hand hovering near Evan's chest. Though her touch was cold, it carried no malice, only sadness. "You carry too much," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Let go." With those words, the crawling sensation beneath Evan's skin vanished. The red bumps faded, leaving behind smooth, unblemished flesh. The whispers ceased entirely, replaced by an eerie silence. The glowing particles dissolved into the air, scattering like stardust until nothing remained. Evan collapsed to his knees, sobbing with relief. Clara rushed to his side, hugging him tightly. "It's over," she murmured. "You did it." When they returned home later that night, the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued their house was gone. The piles of sand, the footprints, the whispers, all of it had disappeared. For the first time in weeks, they slept soundly, free from fear and torment. In the days that followed, Evan began reaching out to Sarah, determined to rebuild the connection they had lost. Though forgiveness wouldn't come easily, he vowed to honor her family's memory by living without guilt or regret. And as he stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Evan realized something important. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be faced, understood, and ultimately released. And sometimes, redemption wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding peace in the hardest truths of all.